Public speakers of all sorts are told from the outset, know your audience. And so today you have a questionnaire and a pencil. Now I confess that for my part, I decline invitations to complete questionnaires. However, this questionnaire can literally be completed in the proverbial 2 ticks. Some questionnaires involve an element of push-pull. That is, they're really designed to make the participant come to a decision as to what they believe. Now, I'm going to hold my hand up, here we go, to say that there is some element of push-pull in this questionnaire. For I truly want you to make a decision on where you stand on the topic, and then honestly to declare it. Not to write what you might think is the right answer, certainly not to write what you might think Brian wants, but to give your honest position, please. 1 out of 10 church sermons, it is estimated, are based upon the Old Testament. And some would like it to be lower, something like 0 out of 10. So why do Christians struggle with or even ignore the Old Testament? It's the Word of God also, isn't it? Personally, I find it fascinating. But there's a common perception that the God who is revealed in the Old Testament is different to the God of the New Testament. It's the 2 God theory. You will hear it said that the God of the Old Testament is vengeful, angry, violent, and warlike. But the God of the New Testament is loving, compassionate, forgiving, and peace-loving. Added to which, the Old Testament seems to be very male-orientated. That's probably because it was written by men. And chunks of the text are really hard-going. And so, for all these reasons, people may find the Old Testament quite a struggle. Marcion, who's an early Christian and the son of a bishop, no less, had the solution, which was to say that Christianity was an entirely new religion founded upon Jesus, and he therefore dismissed all of the Old Testament as mere Judaism and stripped the Gospels down to just Luke. And even then he wasn't happy because he went through removing any reference in Luke to the Old Testament. And others have adopted the same approach, ignoring the whole of the Old Testament. Charles Dickens, for example, was strictly a New Testament Christian. So have you dropped into the approach of, well, I just read and think about the New Testament? If so, options 1A and 2A on the sheet would perhaps describe you. If so, say so. Alternatively, you may have a far more positive view of the Old Testament, that it proves to be the background material or content that enables one to make sense of the New Testament, that it prepares the ground for Christ's coming, that the 2 Testaments are part of one continuing, unified plan of God, that together they present the whole of God's story of salvation history. If that were your view, you would see the Old Testament is essential to understanding of God, his ways, and your discipleship. So despite all the difficulties, you hang on to engaging with the Old Testament, and you include it in your readings and meditations. If so, then options 1B and 2B would be appropriate to describe you. So I've considered the extreme reactions. Give up on the Old Testament versus enthusiasm for engaging with it. There must be a mid-position. Perhaps that is lacking enthusiasm for the Old Testament, but ready to be energized by help from any passionate teacher. If that were the case, then options 1C and 2C would seem to apply. I'm going to ask you to fill in sections 1 and sections 2 on the questionnaire, and there's space beneath for you to write any disclaimer, any variant you wish, any honest opinion. They would all be welcome. You're not forced into the options given. Be honest, for it's your honest opinion that's sought. Be blunt, tell it how it is. I want to move on to the idea of a framework for understanding aspects of the Old Testament. It cannot be denied that the Old Testament is long. I want you to note the number of pages. You've got a book in front of you. How long is the Old Testament? Starts at the beginning. Still going, Daniel, Obadiah, Malachi, that's about the end. That's it. It's that much. Roughly 900 and something pages long. And the New Testament, by comparison, is that much. That's all my notes falling on the floor. Roughly, it's getting on for 1,000 pages, the Old Testament, say 999, because the New Testament is about 330. Say 333. I choose simple numbers. If we say it's 999 versus 333, you can see that the Old Testament is 3 times longer than the New Testament. Or put another way, 3/4 of the Bible is the Old Testament and 1/4 is New Testament. That's probably why, if you ever take on one of these Read the Bible in the Year programs, you will find that you're required to read 3 chapters of the Old Testament and 1 chapter of the New Testament every day. The floor gets further away. The Old Testament covers many hundreds of years. The setting is the ancient Middle East. It extends from Mesopotamia in the northeastern corner, modern Iraq, down to the Nile, the river of Egypt, in the southwest. So there's a lot of time and a lot of space to get your head around, and it's a long, complicated story. But there's a simple framework which I would recommend. There are 2 events in the Old Testament which stand out as markers in their history. And the first is the Exodus, when they left slavery in Egypt to journey to the Promised Land. The date of that is, well, debated, like almost all dates in the Old Testament. Some say 1300 BC, some say 1200 BC. Basically, the further you go back in time, the vaguer the times become. That's the big marker. The second marker is the exile, which is in 586 BC. That is when Jerusalem falls to the Babylonians and all the people in the southern kingdom get carted off to Babylon. And if you're like me, you like to complete the whole framework by adding at the bottom something which occurs not in the Old Testament, but during the period of the New Testament, the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in AD 70. Everything can be put within this historical framework. It happened before the Exodus, or it happened after the Exodus but before the exile, or it happened after the exile and before the destruction of the temple. You can superimpose within this framework any aspect of Old Testament study you like. For example, how they worshipped, or the matter of the promised land. But I'm going to add some other significant points in the story. To begin with, everything in Genesis comes before the Exodus. There's the real old stuff, the primeval history, the prehistory, if you like, which is concerned with such matters as creation, the fall, Noah and the flood, and the Tower of Babel. And then the story begins properly with the appearance of Abraham. And his dates, being further back still, are even vaguer. Some would say 2000 BC, some as late as 1800 BC. Hardly matters, it's certainly in the late Bronze Age. Moving on, after that we get the capture of the Promised Land, the very difficult history of the Judges and time of Ruth, and then appears Samuel, who is the kingmaker, who makes Saul the king, and then David, and then Solomon, of course. That's the period of the unified kingdom. David's a very important person, and his date is about 1000 BC. So as we come down this framework, so we're travelling through time. The axis is probably not linear, more logarithmic if you're used to that sort of system. Solomon builds the temple about 950 BC, and then for about 200 years there is both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, but the northern kingdom after 200 years is captured by the Assyrians and all the people carted off. The southern kingdom of Judah survives for perhaps as much as 400 years before they in turn are captured by the Babylonians. The whole city of Jerusalem is sacked. The temple, the first temple, is destroyed at Solomon's temple, and the people taken into exile. There they stay in exile for perhaps 70 years before beginning to drift back in relatively small amounts or numbers. They start to build the temple, find it's much too big a job, and basically give up. Only when certain prophets appear do they get stuck into the job. And the time of the second temple is even more debated. I put a date there of about 515 BC, but some say as late as 300 BC. Nehemiah, who of course is famous for coming back and building the walls of Jerusalem, about 400 BC. And in the period between exile and the destruction of the second temple, we have Jesus' ministry, birth, ministry, death and resurrection. His birth typically estimated to be 4 BC, which sounds a nonsense, of course. How could Jesus be born before Christ, as it were? Well, they just got the maths wrong, basically. Thing is that Jesus is definitely born when Herod is alive, and Herod dies in 4 BC. So Jesus must have been born in or before 4 BC. He dies, well, the dates that are suggested bearing in mind all the internal evidence in the Bible, is either 30 AD or 33 AD, and I have a preference for the second date. So there are two periods in which there are a temple. The first temple is built by Solomon and totally wrecked by the Babylonians. The second temple is built after the exile and destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. If you read literature about the Old Testament, it will often talk about the first and the second temple periods. You might think that that's pretty obvious. It's from when you build the temple to when it falls down. But in fact, it's a little more complicated. In fact, the second temple period starts with the destruction of the first and proceeds all the way through to the destruction of the second. So the time of Jesus is in the second temple period. With the destruction of the second temple, then sacrificial worship in Jerusalem ends and Judaism becomes based on synagogues, as we know today. So then, I commend this framework to you, that of Exodus, exile, and the destruction of the Second Temple, into which you can fit any aspect of Old Testament study you like. It will help keep you orientated.